Hello, remember on this channel, we expose to you the secrets of real estate investing by bringing to you pieces of information that will enable you maximize your investments in real estate and avoid disputes. This we do as well by bringing to you notifications of properties that are in dispute, properties that are encumbered, and properties that are not in dispute but are not for sale. This will enable you stay away from such landmines that are being marketed as genuine. By the way, my name is Madwe Kenwere. I am a property lawyer, a real estate investor, and by God's grace, the founder, encumberproperties.com. Today, we are looking at the frequently asked questions about real estate investing in Nigeria. And the number one question is, what type of real estate is most profitable? When you begin to look at the type of real estate that is most profitable, you find out that this question is actually very, very relative. It depends on the angle you are coming from, and it also depends on what is available for you as a takeoff. I mean, the amount that is available for you to start doing real estate. However, I must say, if someone that started with 5 million makes a wrong investment by buying a disputed property that swallows his investment capital, you find out that the person that started with 500,000 will definitely do better and overtake him. So it depends on each investor to choose. Under real estate, we have different vehicles. We have rental real estate, we have commercial real estate, we have REIT, that is real estate investment trust. We have land banking and flipping. I love it very well, land banking and flipping. In one of my previous videos, I explained all these things in details. You can check the description to this video to enable you watch and educate yourself on different types of real estate investing. But it suffices to know that what is available to you and your choice is what determines where you start from. And you won't be able to know where you start from except from a standpoint of knowledge. That's why I encourage you to go back and watch that video. The link to the video is included to the description to this video you are watching. So go over to the description and you will see the link. You go over and watch it for your education. Number two frequently asked question about real estate investing in Nigeria is, what is the best time to invest in real estate? Well, some people always say during economic crisis, by that time, properties are always low. You have so many people wanting to sell and less people wanting to buy. However, would you begin to wait for economic downturn in the economy before you begin to buy? The answer is capital no. So my response to that question is, the best time to start doing real estate is now. Start from wherever you are, because if you continue waiting, you will discover along the line that the property you would have bought probably 6 months ago, 2 years ago, would have gained some capital appreciation that would wow your mind. So I encourage you to start from wherever you are now. That is the best time to start. Don't wait for downturn in the economy. Don't wait for rainy season. Don't wait for dry season. The best time to start is now, because time waits for nobody, and the price of real estate is increasing and appreciating every day. So the earlier you cash in, the earlier your investment starts appreciating. The number three question most people ask about real estate investing in Nigeria is, how much do I need to start investing in real estate? This is a question that most beginners ask, but the truth is that you don't need any particular amount to start. As I told you, the best time to start investing in real estate is now. I also want to tell you that the best amount to start with is what you have. You may ask, what if I have less than 10,000 naira? The answer is there for you. We have real estate investment vehicles that will enable you to start with 10,000 naira. In the description to this particular video as well, I have also put a link to where REIT, that is real estate investment trust, is also explained. It is a pool of money where the trust funds pull money from different investors and invest for them and pay them dividends. So you buy according to the amount of money you have. It's like shares. In other words, you can buy it for that of 5,000, you can buy for 10,000, you can buy for 20,000. So the time to start is now. And if you also think you can start with REIT, that is real estate investment trust, why not start with cooperatives? And the good news is that even if you want to start independently without putting your money into a pool, like in the case of cooperative and in the case of real estate investment trust, there are still locations that sell as low as 100,000. Let me shock you. Somewhere in Karo local government, Karo local government is under Nasarawa. Part of Karo local government is in Abuja, part is in Nasarawa. The part that is in Nasarawa, it adjoins Abuja, the part that is in Abuja. Someone called me like a week ago, thereabout, that the family land, they have about 20 plots for sale. And the amount he mentioned is less than 100,000 naira a plot. And the plot in question here is not a real estate plot. It's 100 by 100. In other words, 1,000 square meters. You can actually start with where you are. You can actually start with any amount you have. So stop waiting for when you will gather millions. The good news about the example I just gave to you is that in the next 3 to 5 years, the same plot you bought for less than 100,000, you will be surprised that it will be priced at more than 500,000. So you don't need to wait to have a lot of money to start. You can actually start from where you are. Let me also shock you. The first developed property I bought in Nigeria, Abuja to be precise, that property, when I resold it, I sold it for about 30 million naira. But when I bought it, it was being marketed around 15 million naira. I didn't deposit up to 1 million naira. And I was about to get that property under a structured payment plan. There are a lot of companies. There are so many genuine companies that are everywhere looking for people who have credibility, whom they can vouch on their ability to pay. And let me tell you, the money I was paying the company on yearly basis, I mean the real estate company on yearly basis, I was able to realize it plus some fraction from the rent. I was able to realize it from the annual rent of that same property. So the truth is that you don't really need any capital to start doing real estate. What you need is what? Your will and determination. That takes us to the fourth frequently asked question about real estate investing in Nigeria. Besides the type of real estate to start, besides the amount you need, people also ask, what else do they need to start doing real estate? The answer is this: what you need most than any amount of money is your will and your determination. I tell you, with your will and determination in place, you would always get what is within your range, within your price budgeting. So I tell you, make up your mind to start today, and in less than 24 months from now, you will thank me for encouraging you to start from where you are. The number 5 frequently asked questions about real estate investing in Nigeria is, where do I get undiluted information that will help me avoid being scammed? You know, in the system today, at every nook and cranny you look at, you see people marketing real estate. On the street, you see people marketing real estate. So you really find it difficult to know who is real and who is not real. However, there is a company and there is a website that does real estate, but it doesn't do buying and selling. The only thing the company does is to bring to you information on disputed properties, encumbered properties, and properties that are not for sale. If you go on this website, they are not after your money because they are not marketing any property. They are not into buying and selling of real properties. The only thing they do is to bring you information about properties that you shouldn't buy into, properties that are being set as landmines, as I earlier said, in order to collect money from unsuspecting buyers. And there is no other platform than encumberedproperties.com. It brings you information about encumbered property, the details, the location, the address, attaching the survey plan, the Google map as the case may be, helping you avoid buying into such properties. It also goes ahead to give you brief history of the crisis surrounding any such property. So anytime you want to buy any property, anytime you are looking for information that will help you stay out of disputed properties, always search at encumberedproperties.com with the address of the property that is being marketed to you, or with the Google map, or with the survey plan. All you need to do, you type in the location of the property that is being marketed to you. When you type in all the properties that are in dispute, encumbered, or marked not for sale, they will all pop up and you will be able to advise and guide yourself. So looking for a platform where you will get undiluted information to enable you stay out of disputes in the course of investing in real estate is encumberedproperties.com. With encumberedproperties.com, you can never get it wrong investing in real estate. The sixth question frequently asked by a lot of people is whether a foreigner can invest in Nigeria real estate. Some people, they have partners, you've traveled abroad, you've met some friends, and you want them to partner with you or to even buy from you your properties, your real estate, whether developed or undeveloped, and you're asking the question whether a foreigner can invest in Nigeria or can buy real estate in Nigeria. Of course, whether the foreigner is resident in Nigeria or not even resident in Nigeria, the person is covered. The person has right to acquire real property, real estate. So a foreigner is protected under our constitution, under our laws, to acquire property anywhere in Nigeria. The seventh frequently asked question about real estate investing in Nigeria is whether a lawyer must be involved in every real estate transaction. The answer I will give here is conditional, in the sense that the law provides that for every medium of transfer of interest in land, such a document has to be franked. Franked must be prepared and signed by a lawyer. However, we have so many interest in properties being transferred without a lawyer being involved, and they are really valid. It becomes a technical issue where, for instance, the same seller sells to another buyer after selling to you, and that buyer comes on with a lawyer who drafts and registers the deed of assignment. So in this case, you find out that the person that has done the right thing, the law would always pander on his side. One of the rules of equity is that equity helps the vigilance. So in this case, where there is a dispute over the same land you have bought without complying with the required regulations and the law, you find out that the person that has acquired the same property through the same seller, but complying with the expected procedures, having a lawyer draft the deed of assignment, franking it, registering it, and obtaining governor's consent, you find out that this person is safer with the title, unlike the person that didn't do the right thing. But you will get away with it if by the end of the day, there is no contrary claim over the property. But when there is a contrary claim over the same property you have bought, you find out that you are on your way to losing out. And when there is a contrary claim again, you find out also that what you have saved, because what most people run away from is the 10% fee they pay the lawyer that handles the transaction. You find out that what you have saved by not involving a lawyer, you lose in multiple fold over the disputes on the title you acquired wrongly. So it's advised and you are encouraged to always involve a lawyer in your property transactions. You are safer that way. The person guides you better as well. The pitfalls and defects in title you can't easily see. The lawyer can easily spot it out. And as I have always said, does it mean that if a lawyer is involved, the whole transaction will be scam-free? There have been several transactions where lawyers are involved and yet they were not able to dictate the scam coming, and the client, or their client rather, ended up being scammed. But most often, it is being minimized if a lawyer is involved. The next frequently asked question is, how long does it take for property transaction to be concluded? You are buying a property and you start the process. How long does it take for it to be concluded? Again, the answer to this question is relative, in the sense that when you indicate your interest in buying a particular property, there are procedures of confirmations, verifications. Sometimes you apply to a land bureau for them to give you an encumbrance report about a property. They might begin to look for the file. The file might not be existent at all, or the property has not even been registered in the land bureau for the first time at all. So in this kind of circumstance, you have to exercise patience, you have to backtrack and begin to make inquiries through other sources. For instance, going around the vicinity where the property is located, going around, if for instance it is a property that has customary title as proof of ownership, or especially properties that are inherited from father or grandfathers, you find out that you go to village head, you go to town head, you go to uncles, brothers, you have a lot of things to do in order to obtain a very valid title for yourself that will give you rest of mind by the end of the day. Now, if for instance too, there is no red flag anywhere and you visit encumberproperties.com, one thing about encumberproperties.com is that the search result from encumberproperties.com is what you get instanta. As you are typing the location or the coordinates of the property, it is being popped up and you are seeing every detail about the property. However, I don't really advise you that, okay, after you search at encumberproperties.com and there is no encumbrance about the property, you should just go ahead and purchase. Still do other due diligences that you need to do. As I earlier said, check at land registry, ask questions about the person selling to you, and also confirm from encumberproperties.com. Somebody might have flagged it at encumberproperties.com. Somebody must have indicated interest or enlisted it as being in one court or the other. Let me tell you, let me shock you. There are so many properties that are disputed, but they are not being updated at the land registry. I don't want to begin to mention name. For instance, Broadview Estate, it is encumbered, it's in dispute. The funny thing is that you search at FCDA, you won't see that there is dispute over the property. The estate is still selling, and those who have bought are reselling, getting their profit. But most people don't know about this. But I'm telling you on this platform because at encumberproperties.com, we owe you the truth and we owe you the whole truth. This is the only platform where you come and you get the whole information raw, the way it is. Our target and our objective is to make sure that you don't fall into any landmine in the name of investing in real estate. The ninth frequently asked question about real estate investing in Nigeria is, how and where do I verify title to the property I want to buy? As I've earlier mentioned, the land bureau or the land registry where this property is situated, that is one of the places you verify. And at encumberproperties.com, that is another place you verify. Asking questions around is another place you verify. Ask questions around where the property is located, about the background of the person who is selling it to you. These are most of the vital places you get the information you need from. So this point has already been explained in the earlier discuss. The 10th frequently asked question in the course of land acquisition in Nigeria, which most people ask, is what is excision? Excision in land or in real estate simply means to cut off a particular part of property. Excision means to remove from. So excision in this context is where, for instance, if the government has an overriding interest in a particular land within your locality, and they say, okay, this is 2,000 hectares. They take over the property for overriding public interest. Out of these 2,000 hectares, they decide we are not going to completely cut the locals whom this property originally belonged to out of the benefit of what is happening in this area. We are going to develop it into more density. They now give the locals conditions. These are the conditions you meet. This is how you develop. This is how you pattern it. This is what you do. This is what you do. For that, we are giving you people back 500 hectares of this land while the government is retaining 1,500 hectares for the purpose, for our purpose. So we have excision. In this case, 500 hectares comes under what we call excision in land banking, and if it is gazetted or any instrument with which government conveys back these 500 hectares becomes a valid title. In other words, when you buy and you have this excision document or gazette backing your acquisition of the property, it is a valid title to the property. So excision in real estate simply means a portion of land the government is giving back to a people, the government is giving back to you. It is official, it is valid, it is binding. It is, in fact, one of the prime titles in real estate after C of O. In fact, it ranks above R of O. The 11th frequently asked question about real estate investing in Nigeria is, what are the different titles to property in Nigeria? The different titles to property in Nigeria we are talking about has to do with proof of ownership. When we talk about titles simply means the proof of ownership. What do you have to show that this property actually belongs to you. So as earlier mentioned while explaining excision, in fact, excision is part of it. Excision is a proof of ownership. C of O's, that is certificate of occupancy, is a proof of ownership. We have statutory right of occupancy. Statutory right of occupancy is being given to you by the governor if the property is within urban area, within the town. Then we have customary right of occupancy. Customary right of occupancy is if the land is being conveyed to you or given to you by the local government or by the local council. If it is in Abuja, for instance, the area councils, what you get from them is customary right of occupancy, while FCT minister for land within the municipal is backed up by statutory right of occupancy. So these are some of the land titles you get. You also find out that deed of assignment backed up with governor's consent is also a title to land. So these are the commonest titles to land. In the order of priority, I've mentioned C of O, excision, R of O, then before customary right of occupancy, if it is ordinary deed. Some people also take a power of attorney as a title to land, depending on the circumstance. Depending on the circumstance, you go ahead and register it and authenticate it. Then it can also rank at the same level with deed of assignment. It also depends on the location where you find yourself. In some locations, you are not expected to use deed and power of attorney, but cutting across board is deed of assignment. The 12th frequently asked question in real estate investing in Nigeria is, what is survey plan? People hear survey plan, a lot of people get confused whether survey plan is also a title deed, whether survey plan is a means of transfer of interest in land. Survey plan is not a title deed. It's not also a medium of transfer of any interest in land. Rather, survey plan is only a graphical representation of the location of the property on paper. In other words, survey plan shows you where the property is located. Survey plan shows you the size of the property. Survey plan shows you the boundaries of the property. In other words, the limit of the property. That is what the survey plan shows to you. It is a paper representation of the property you are negotiating to buy. A miniature representation of the property you are negotiating to buy. So survey plan is never a means of transfer. It only gives you an idea of what you are buying, the location it is, the boundaries, and what have you. The 13th frequently asked question, especially from newbies, new investors who are buying property for the first time, is, what are the red flags? What and what would they see to know that a property is not genuine? Let's say, for instance, you have not searched about the details of the background of the property from encumberedproperties.com. You've not been to any land registry. You don't have any information about the property. The commonest red flag is where somebody is marketing a property to you, especially a property that is within a developed area, a property that is not inherited through oral narration or from great grandfathers and what have you. And the property is not backed by any title document at all. The person is not presenting any title document to you. Probably what the person has is the map of the property in the form of a survey plan. And the person is telling you this property exists so location without any evidence of proof of ownership from anybody. That is a red flag. That is a red flag. The second red flag is where there is pressure. If the person marketing the property to you is not giving you opportunity to ask questions, to make inquiries. So when there is pressure or you are being rushed into making up your mind, it is a red flag. And another red flag is where the person is hesitant taking you to the location of the property. You can't even physically inspect the property. You can't get any information surrounding the ownership of the property. So these are some of the few red flags you will see to know that a property is not genuine. In this circumstance, I will advise you to walk away from such a transaction. So please, cut off wrong with your knees touching your head. Cut it off, please. The 14th frequently asked question, especially from new investors in Nigeria who are living abroad, is how safe it is to buy property off plan. And what is off plan? Off plan is a situation where you start paying for property or you pay for property while giving the developer time. For instance, you are buying a block of terrace. For instance, in Wuye and the property is being marketed, for instance, 250 million, and you are asked to deposit 50% of it and spread the remaining 50% within a period of 12 months, and you start paying, you make the deposit. A lot of people are scared. How can I drop, for instance, 50% of 250 million? How safe it is? Well, the answer is that you are safe if you are dealing with a real estate company that has a track record already. However, there are so many real estate companies that don't have any integrity at all, that lack integrity. So off plan is really risky, but it's something you can do if you can make your background investigations about the past of any real estate company. We have a couple of them. I can tell you about Dynamo. I can also tell you about GTEX. I can also tell you about Brains and Hammers. For instance, Urban Shelters too. I've done deal with Urban Shelters, reliable. These 4 real estate companies and a couple of other time wouldn't allow me to mention are really reliable. But even at that, I will still encourage you to do your own background investigation about the characters, about the persons, about the management, about the persons behind all these real estate companies. Are they people with integrity? Do they have good track record? Have they kept their words? For how long? Over time? So when you do all these things with reference from people who have dealt with them previously, you will be able to have a peace of mind in staking your investment capital with them. The 15th question most newcomers into real estate or most first land buyers ask is, what are the documents I should expect while buying or after buying a property? You find out that most often, if you don't know, you won't really know what to demand for. So number one document that should be handed over to you is the document of title. If it is a land that is backed by C of O, for instance, they should hand over the C of O to you. If it is a land that is backed by statutory right of occupancy, that document should be handed over to you. The same thing if it is customary right of occupancy, if it is deed of assignment backed by governor's consent, if it is power of attorney, if it is the excision, the gazette, the document backing the original acquisition of or transfer of that property to anybody, you are entitled to that document. You are also entitled to deed of assignment, which conveys the title to the land to you, now the current and new owner. You are also entitled to every other document that relates to that particular plot of land, and also receipts of payment. For instance, if you paid in multiple times, all the receipts of payment or acknowledgement of your payment, they are supposed to be given to you. So these are some of the basic requirements or documents you should expect, including contract of sale if there was some pre-agreement before the main deed of assignment was signed. And of course, the photocopies of these documents are what you expected to submit while registering your interest in the land or updating your interest in the land. If it is, for instance, at encumberedproperties.com, a photocopy of the survey plan. Of course, survey plan is one of the documents that should be handed over to you. A copy of the survey plan, which you upload on the website, with which people can exactly confirm the location of your property, in addition to your phone number and the name, which you will attach to the enlistment on the platform. The 16th frequently asked question in real estate acquisition in Nigeria is, what is the encumbrance? You might have heard me mention encumbered, encumbrance a couple of times since the beginning of this video. The question is, what is encumbrance? Encumbrance means any claim, any charge, any lien that makes the transfer of the property or the enjoyment of the property limited. Anything that makes your sale or the transfer of the property to another person not to be done or not to be easily done is an encumbrance. I give you an example. If a property is under charge, mortgage, you use it as a collateral, or there is a contrary claim, either in court or out of court, once there is a dispute over the property, these are forms of encumbrances. So it is a legal term. There is no deed of assignment or conveyance in property that doesn't have a clause talking about encumbrance. So it is something you need to understand. Once you hear about encumbrance regarding any property, it is a red flag. encumberproperties.com. It is a platform that takes enlistment of every property that is encumbered in every location on the planet Earth. All you need to do is type the location. You will see the encumbered properties in that location, and you will know the nature of the encumbrance, whether it is something you can risk. Some encumbrances doesn't really affect the transfer of the title in the property. Some encumbrances are so serious that you don't need to venture saying that you want to buy the property. For instance, if it is a contrary claim over the title to the land, it is not safe for you to begin to negotiate buying the property, because you end up buying dispute, you end up losing your invested capital. So encumbrance, as I earlier said, has to do with a contrary claim. Encumbrance has to do with a property that is under charge, a collateral is on top of it, or a lien. So generally, once a property is encumbered, you are advised to stay off it. And that is what we do at encumberproperties.com. We bring you update and information about encumbered properties so that you can learn to stay out of them for your interest and for the safety of your invested capital, so that you don't lose your money. That is the business of encumberproperties.com. Watching your back, making sure that you don't invest wrongly. Now, 17th frequently asked question in real estate investing in Nigeria is, what is zoning and why is zoning important? You might not understand what this means, but if you're a town planner or you work in any development control or land registry, you will understand what zoning is. But for the sake of your investment or business in real estate, it's good that you have an idea of what zoning is. Zoning has to do with what government has earmarked to do with each zone or each location. You know, when you get to a city, you see industrial area, you see agricultural area, you see recreational area, you also see residential area. All these are zoned with clear demarcations and boundaries. Why is it important that you know about zoning is because if an area has been earmarked for industrial purpose and somebody takes you to the same area telling you that there is a residential plot within that industrial area, it is a red flag, in the sense that you won't be allowed by the development plan or architecture of the particular city you are in, you won't be allowed to site a residential building within an industrial area. You won't also be allowed to do the same thing within agricultural area. So when you have idea of the zoning system within the area you operate or within the area you want to buy property from, it enables you to dictate when a seller or when a realtor is actually being fraudulent, when he's lying to you, when he wants to scam you, when he wants to deceive you. And you may not really know. Development control officers, they will guide you. If a realtor knows his onion within a particular locality he operates, he would also be able to guide you. But I tell you, it's always better to get the idea of zoning from official sources and not from a realtor that you are bargaining to buy property through. Most people, when you are trying to buy properties from them, they tell you half truth. So go behind the person who is marketing the location to you and make inquiries. Someone is marketing this location to me. What is this location meant for? You will hear that, okay, it is residential. If it is residential, you go ahead with your bargain and do other searches that you need to do. The 18th frequently asked questions, mostly from first-timers in real estate investment, is how do I register my property? For instance, you want to register your property in the land bureau, in the land registry. It goes with application through the Ministry of Lands. Then you attach your deed of assignment, you attach the survey plan, you attach every other relevant document that has to do with the property you have acquired. Then the receipt of payment, application fee, or attaching the receipt of the fee for the governor's consent. You attach all these, submit, and depending on the location, within a space of time, sometimes it takes minimum of 3 months. Even at 3 months is fast. In some other cases, depending, there are so many factors that determine how fast this particular document will come back to you, or how fast you can conclude the registration of your title in any particular land. But if you are enlisting it at encumberproperties.com, within 5 minutes, you have completed the enlistment process. And this enlistment process is a public notice. It's like a caveat. Anywhere, anytime it is being searched, the property will indicate your name as a property that is not in dispute but not for sell. The next question someone who wants to register his property could ask, which is also a frequently asked question, is what fees are applicable if I want to register my property? Capital gains tax, governor's consent fee, stamp duty, application and registration fees. And the amounts for all these subheads I've mentioned, they vary from state to state. So you need to meet a practicing property lawyer within the jurisdiction where you bought your property and where you want to register in order to get the actual amount. You can as well on your own walk into the land registry to find out the prices for yourself. The last and the final question which people who are investing in real estate in Nigeria often ask is whether there is any database anywhere in the world that keeps record of properties that are in dispute or properties that people shouldn't buy from. I've earlier answered this particular question in the course of my explanation of the other questions asked. The only platform on earth where people keep record of properties that are in dispute, that are not for sale, that are disputed, or properties that are not in dispute but not for sale is one platform, and that platform is encumberproperties.com. It has record of every property. People on their own come to the website to enlist properties that are in dispute. Sometimes it is in the public interest. They get to know that a property is under government acquisition. They enlist it there. They get to know that a property, a road is supposed to pass through a particular empty land. They enlist it there so that you won't mistakenly buy such a property. And if a property is in dispute, a rival claimant can sell it even before you know it. It's also in your own interest that you enlist it there so that people will also know and avoid buying from it. When you do all this, you are saving yourself from the embarrassment you will realize that after the judgment has been given in your favor, you discover that another person innocently bought your property. So before that happens to you, it's only advisable that you enlist such a property that this property is in dispute. And when you do that, immediately the dispute is over and judgment is given on your behalf and in your favor. You come back and delist it. When you indicate through the same channel you enlisted it, it will be removed, indicating that judgment has been given in this particular property and it is in so person's favor. So it is a very perfect platform for your safety, not only for your safety and for the safety of innocent buyers who would have ordinarily gone to buy without knowing that is in dispute. So do yourself a favor today and also share this video, because we have come to the end of the frequently asked questions. Until I come your way again, remember, encumberproperties.com got your back in ensuring that you don't fall victim while investing in real estate. Thank you. Bye for now.